Hi. We reached the end of 1 Samuel 14 today with a surprising piece from the narrator here that summarizes both the reign of Saul and his victories and tells us something about his family members. Surrounded by the honey don't scene that we spent the last 3 videos looking at, which ends with the people siding with Jonathan and against Saul's rash threat to kill his own son over eating a little honey, and the chapter that follows where Samuel appears again, perhaps to our surprise if we don't know what's coming, to chastise Saul and tell him that Yahweh has taken the kingship away from him for not killing King Agag of the Amalekites. So, surrounded by 2 negative stories of Saul is this summary that's relatively positive, in fact a kind of standard summary of a king's military victories that we see a number of times in the Deuteronomistic history, especially in the stories in Kings where we often hear almost nothing but a brief summary of them and don't hear any details of their life and how they got to be king or anything else about them. But another interesting aspect of this, besides the fact that it's placed between these 2 pieces, is its close connection with 2 Samuel 8, which we'll look at in a minute, with very similar events about the reign of David. And again, partway through his reign, not all the way through. This is 2 Samuel 8, and coming up after that are a number of important passages that continue David's reign according to the book of Samuel. So we can see some of those here. We'll come back to those in a minute. So as we explore this, one of the questions to ask, and as I ask it, I realize it's unanswered, but at least we can provide some, or even unanswerable, provide some perspective, is what is this doing here? As Fackelman notes down in my note down below in the left corner, the inclusion of this positive picture of Saul is a dialectic act of great dynamism and far-reaching thematic consequences, makes it a priori impossible for the reader to remain locked in the naive position of a condemnatory attitude to Saul, taking Samuel's side. And so where does it come from? As we've been exploring from the beginning of this series, scholars have argued for decades, if not centuries now, about sources for this narrative. And as we've looked at the very beginning, sources can be argued to take place from contemporaneous with the reign of David in the 10th century BCE or so, all the way down to the Hellenistic era around the time of Maccabees and Daniel, 8 centuries or 7 centuries later. So I'm not concerned with that so much as I am approaching this from another angle as I've been doing. We cannot ever really answer the question of what were all the various sources, but we do know is somebody was the final editor or some group of people who put all these pieces together, recognizing that there are conflicts, that there are different views about whether Saul was chosen by God, whether Saul lost the kingship because Yahweh withdrew approval, or because Saul did bad things, or because David conquered him, a variety of possibilities that we'll see in the chapters that unfold after this. But what it certainly says, and this is true about the entire Hebrew Bible, and I said more about this in my book, Come Out My People, that I've showed a couple of times in this series, is the Bible, contrary to what some people falsely understand it to be, is not one consistent argument, one consistent portrayal of God, but a set of perspectives, in this case on the reign of Saul. And again, if you can take aside the later Christian lens that through the values of Greek Platonism and others that sought to find exact words and doctrines that would single out who was in and who was out in the Roman imperial world within the realm of Christianity, through affirming language, the Hebrew Bible has nothing to do with that ever. It's much more about telling stories that are open-ended and leaving gaps and spaces, as Meyer Sternberg has so expertly pointed out in his long career of exploring the literary character of the Hebrew Bible, but also to highlight, as Sternberg also points out, the ideological conflicts. In other words, the people of the time did not all agree. Imagine that, any more than all U.S. Americans or Australians or anybody else who might be watching this video would say that they all agree with whoever they see themselves as a group, a national group, an ethnic group, a religious group, a racial group, or whatever it might be. So the Hebrew Bible is much more realistic than the false notion that Christianity tried to impose, that everybody sees things exactly the same way or they wouldn't be part of the community. Rather, that there was ambivalence about Saul and many points of view. By putting it here, right in between 2 negative things, as Fackelman notes, it certainly causes us to slow down a little bit in thinking what a bad guy Saul was. Because if we take this passage here as telling us something true, whether we think of that as historically true or at least true within the narrative that's being created here in the books of Samuel, then it's certainly positive. And so let's look at it more closely, and I'll keep up the parallels on the side here with 2 Samuel 8 as we look at some of the details here. So when Saul had taken the kingship, there are two times that taken is used here that might suggest the kind of taking we saw in 1 Samuel 8 when Yahweh told Samuel to tell the people the way of the king, and we heard take 6 times. But this is a different verb here. This is lakad, the word for the lot that we saw in the previous passage that we saw didn't really mean lot, but meant catch, to be caught. So we could say here Saul had caught the kingship over Israel, or perhaps was caught in the kingship, as we see Alter put it in that passive sense. So Saul had been caught in the kingship. And we saw that was true early on. He didn't seek it. He wasn't lobbying for it. We have no reason to think he wanted it at all or ever thought about it until Samuel came to him and put it upon him. We see the phrase for kingship, Melaleuca, here was mentioned at 10:16, and we can look back at the video for that if you want to know more. The narrator tells us he fought against all his enemies. And notice the contrast with how Jonathan put it just a few verses earlier in verse 30, Israel's enemies, which is certainly what you expect the king to have. But if anybody who's lived through the Trump era in the United States knows, and hear Trump talk about his own enemies, we know how easily it can become personal in situations of power. So the narrator acknowledges that by recognizing that Saul's talking about his enemies without calling them Israel's enemies. And note that Israel isn't mentioned here at all. Enemies on every side and against these different nations, which as my individual notes show are often almost all not mentioned between this passage we're looking at now and this passage many chapters later. So in Moab here we see not mentioned till chapter 8 verse 12. Ammonites again not till verse 12. Edom here also in verse 12, and Zobah in 8:3 as we see up here. And Philistines, of course, throughout. So many of these are never narrated in the Saul situation. Plainly, this is meant to link these together and compare them. And we'll do that in just a moment to see the differences in addition to the similarities. And, of course, against the Philistines, who we've seen all along, wherever he turned, and again, this is a different word for the turning we saw as a key word in the last passages, he turned, he routed them. Or as Samora helps us see, the word Yarshia here would surge over them like a swarm of locusts. And my note below notes that the actual word has ambiguous meaning. It can mean to make oneself guilty, like lead a delinquent life, which would be a negative thing here, or as an adjective, one guilty of a crime, negatively. But it can also mean this. So perhaps readers who are familiar with the ambiguity might also hear a hint that Saul had a more negative side here in addition to a successful military side. Similarly with the word translated valiantly here, Hayil, we see it a number of times. The translations, as I note here, range between two options for the phrase Vayash Hayil. Literally, it means he made power, or he powerfully made. But the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, the standard Hebrew lexicon, shows Hayil meaning as force or army. So we see these two definitions from there, either like the translation here, valiantly, bravely, became strong, or gathering or gathered as an army or host. So both of those could fit here. We could hear he gathered an army and struck the Amalekites, or he did valiantly, either way. The Amalekites have not been narrated before in Samuel, but they'll be the focus of the next chapter. So we'll see that a couple of things the narrator is doing is anticipating the next chapter, although he seems to be summarizing events that are never narrated in the story, like fighting against the kings of Zobah or against Edom or Moab there. So, and he rescued Israel, again, a different word from what Jonathan did, which was the Yeshua word, to save Israel. And this is a different word, netzel here, recalling 12:10-11, Samuel's summary of Yahweh's saving deeds. So there we saw that Yahweh rescued Israel, and here it's that Saul rescued Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. And the verb shosahu here is only in Judges earlier and one other time, and it's described previously as Yahweh sending plunderers as punishment. So he's doing what earlier was described as being done in the name of Yahweh. But Yahweh is not mentioned here at all. Nothing in this passage attributes any of this, whether Saul's victories or his specific acts, to Yahweh. So that's the simple summary of his military victories in 2 verses. And then we see some interesting things about his family. So let's move it up here so we can see this whole section. The sons of Saul were, and we've seen Jonathan already, and then we hear these two, Ishvi, never mentioned again, and Malchishua here, who's mentioned only in passing. No mention of Ishbaal or Abinadab here, who will be named later as sons of Saul. So it's an interesting thing. Scholars can say that's from a different source, perhaps. Perhaps Ishvi and Ishbaal become the same person. A number of people have different names. When we see Solomon, we'll see that Solomon has at least 2, if not 3 different names. And so it's possible that these are just different ways of referring to Ishbaal or Abinadab, or perhaps different traditions. But we hear that Saul has 3 sons, and then we hear surprisingly of 2 daughters, which you almost never hear about kings and important people like this. And yet these two will be important in the story. The firstborn was Merab, and we'll see her in chapter 18 and then in 2 Samuel near the end, and of Michal, who will be seen again in 1820 and will become a very important a person, one of the wives of David. The phrase for firstborn in the younger here echoes, or maybe it echoes the other direction, Leah and Rachel. And we'll look later at a comparison. I'll also do this in my Genesis series, where the whole Laban, Rachel, Leah, Jacob situation is allegorically parallel to the David and Saul and his wives situation. So we'll look at that more later, especially around the connection of teraphim, and that's what the reference is down here in my note. We'll look at that at a later time. So Merab and Michal, and again seen later. We can look now at the name of Saul's wife, Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. Ahinoam, meaning my brother's delight, is never mentioned again as such, but we'll hear in chapter 25, after David has taken Abigail from her husband Nabal, we hear a list of David's wives, and we hear Ahinoam of Jezreel. So here Ahinoam is named as the daughter of her father. Here an Ahinoam is named as from a place. Jezreel is a place, not a person. Are those the same people slyly referred to that David took Saul's wife, much as he'll take Bathsheba as a wife from one of his generals, as we'll see, Uriah later? The text leaves that ambiguous. And the name of the commander of the army was Abner. And a couple things to look at here. I've noted the New RSV often translated the Hebrew word am, which simply means people, as army or troops, and that was simply wrong, or soldiers. They were just the people. And especially that's important because now for the first time we hear explicitly military words. So let's look at that a little more closely here. So commander of the army, Sar Sevav. Sar is almost always a term for a royal official or a military leader, somebody who's under somebody powerful. So we see this in Sevav here is clearly army. And so for the first time, the people are shown to be organized militarily. And then we hear about Abner, son of Ner, Saul's uncle. And there's a couple of ambiguous things here. Is Abner Saul's uncle, or is Ner Saul's uncle? Does that matter directly? It matters whether they're the same generation. In other words, whether Saul's taking orders from his father's brother, or at least having his commander be his father's brother, who would be taking orders from him, or are they peers? So we need to look at the ambiguity here. Abner, son of Ner, and that's almost what it means, Abner, or Ner is my father, Saul's uncle. Is that Ner Saul's uncle or Abner Saul's uncle? And to make sense of that, we need to look at a couple of things. This is clarifying 10:14 to 16 here, where Saul was first sent out for the donkeys. When Samuel meets him, we're told here Saul's uncle said to him, but we didn't have a name there. So we hear here now there's a name, Ner, Saul's uncle, and Abner is son of Ner, and that sets this up here for this situation. So the untangling of this family line, as I note, requires us to recall 9:1 back here. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, son of Zeror. So Saul is Abiel's grandson, and so we hear here that similarly Abner is the son of Ner, who's the son of Abiel. So in other words, Abner is also the grandchild of Abiel, which makes Abner and Saul cousins. Okay, I hope that makes sense after all that untangling. It is tricky. And the only reason it matters exactly is that we'll see the relation between Saul and Abner later, and we can wonder about that. Just interesting note here that would be visible for the Hebrew audience. The word for uncle here, dod, is visually identical to David, and let's look at that here. So we see that in the Hebrew here, you can see uncle, this word dod, and you can see the transliteration says dod, and you look at that there. And if you can put that in your mind and then look here at David and see they're identical. These vowels, this little thing down here and this little thing up there, as I've noted, are added later. So only the consonants, the big letters in the middle, show us the word, and that's David, and this is uncle, and both also mean beloved. And so there's an interesting play on words there that we'll come back to when we get to David in chapter 16. And so to complete our little unit here, we hear Already that Kish is the father of Saul. We already did that, and we get down to 52 here. As Alter notes, this report of constant military conscription indicates the institutionalization of the monarchy and also accords with Samuel's warning, which is that the monarchy would become a fixed thing it would begin to take. And yet again, took here is a different word that we'll get to in just a second. So there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. The phrase hamilchama hazakah here, only here and again in 2 Samuel, referring to David's fighting there. And when Saul saw any strong warrior, anticipating the calling of David there, and again we have to look the phrase here, strong or valiant warrior, Kal ish gibor v'kal ben ha'il. We just saw Ahil in verse 48 for valiant, but we've seen Gibor either earlier. That's what Kish was described as, Saul's father. So in other words, when he sees anybody who looks like a good warrior, he gathered them to himself. Again, this is not exactly the taking word. He gathered them to himself. So he's beginning to recruit warriors now. It's not just the people who were around him, who were always around him. Now he's acting like a king and recruiting warriors. So let's conclude by looking at a couple of the details of this comparison here between the scene we just looked at and the one in 2 Samuel, which of course we'll look at in detail there. I've already noted the description that they both fought against the same kind of people, but two details. We've already noted here no mention of Yahweh here, and yet on this side, Yahweh gave victory to David wherever he went. King David dedicated to Yahweh, etc. And so the David side clearly says that Yahweh is for David and David is for Yahweh there. But as we've seen, Yahweh is not talking to Saul, and that's going to be a problem. We also see this business about the professionalization of the army. So the part we just saw about Abner, and we see the similar thing here, Joab, who becomes David's counterpart to Abner, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. And now David not only has a commander of the army, but an entire royal cabinet. And we'll again look at that later, including mercenaries, the Cherethites and the Pelethites, who are mercenary armies. So we'll see in the time between one reign and the next, the institution of monarchy becomes more deeply established and structured into a bureaucracy. And of course, the generation after David, it'll be established into a temple with King Solomon. So now, next time we'll look at this incredibly long story in a number of scenes where Samuel seems to appear out of nowhere, as we see in this first verse, and again challenges Saul before Samuel leaves the scene. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.